As expected, however, the impetus from these influences faded in the second half of the year, leading inflation to decline from an annual rate of about 3.5% in the first half of 2011 to about 1.5% in the second half, close to its average pace in the preceding 2 years. In an environment of well-anchored inflation expectations, more stable commodity prices, and substantial slack in labor and product markets, we expect inflation to remain subdued. Against that backdrop, the FOMC decided last week to maintain its highly accommodative stance of monetary policy. In particular, the committee decided to continue its program to extend the average maturity of its securities holdings, to maintain its existing policy of reinvesting principal payments on its portfolio of securities, and to keep the target range for the federal funds rate at 0 to 1/4%. The committee now anticipates that economic conditions are likely to warrant exceptionally low levels of the federal funds rate at least through late 2014. As part of our ongoing effort to increase the transparency and predictability of monetary policy, following its January meeting, the FOMC released a statement intended to provide greater clarity about the committee's longer-term goals and policy strategy. The statement begins by emphasizing the Federal Reserve's firm commitment to pursue its congressional mandate to foster stable prices and maximum employment. To clarify how it seeks to achieve those objectives, the FOMC stated its collective view that inflation at the rate of 2%, as measured by the annual change in the price index for personal consumption expenditures, is most consistent over the longer run with the Federal Reserve's statutory mandate. And it indicated that the central tendency of FOMC participants' current estimates of the longer run normal rate of unemployment is between 5.2 and 6%. The statement noted that these statutory objectives are generally complementary, but when they are not, the committee will take a balanced approach in its efforts to return both inflation and employment to their desired levels. In my remaining remarks, I'd like to briefly discuss the fiscal challenges facing your committee and the country. The federal budget deficit widened appreciably with the onset of the recent recession, and it has averaged around 9% of GDP over the past 3 fiscal years. This exceptional increase in the deficit has mostly reflected the automatic cyclical response of revenues and spending to a weak economy, as well as the fiscal actions taken to ease the recession and aid the recovery. As the economy continues to expand and stimulus policies are phased out, the budget deficit should narrow over the next few years. Unfortunately, even after economic conditions have returned to normal, the nation will still face a sizable structural budget gap if current budget policies continue. Using information from the recent budget outlook by the CBO, one can construct a projection for the federal deficit assuming that most expiring tax provisions are extended and that the Medicare's physician payment rates are held at their current level. Under these assumptions, the budget deficit would be more than 4% of GDP in fiscal year 2017, assuming that the economy is then close to full employment. Of even greater concern is that longer-run projections based on plausible assumptions about the evolution of the economy and the budget under current policies show the structural budget gap increasing significantly further over time and the ratio of outstanding federal debt to GDP rising rapidly. This dynamic is clearly unsustainable. These structural imbalances did not emerge overnight. To a significant extent, they are the result of an aging population and especially fast-rising healthcare costs, both of which have been predicted for decades. Notably, the CBO projects that net federal outlays for healthcare entitlements, which were about 5% of GDP in fiscal 2011, could rise to more than 9% of GDP by 2035. Although we have been warned about such developments for many years, the time when projections become reality is coming closer. Having a large and increasing level of government debt relative to national income runs the risk of serious economic consequences. Over the longer term, the current trajectory of federal debt threatens to crowd out private capital formation and thus reduce productivity growth. To the extent that increasing debt is financed by borrowing from abroad, a growing share of our future income would be devoted to interest payments on foreign-held federal debt. High levels of debt also impair the ability of policymakers to respond effectively to future economic shocks and other adverse events. Even the prospect of unsustainable deficits has costs, including an increased possibility of a sudden fiscal crisis. As we've seen in a number of countries recently, interest rates can soar quickly if investors lose confidence in the ability of a government to manage its fiscal policy. Although historical experience and economic theory do not indicate the exact threshold at which the perceived risks associated with the U.S. public debt would increase markedly, we can be sure that without corrective action, our fiscal trajectory will move the nation ever closer to that point. To achieve economic and financial stability, U.S. fiscal policy must be placed on a sustainable path that ensures that debt relative to national income is at least stable or preferably declining over time. Attaining this goal should be a top priority. Even as fiscal policymakers address the urgent issue of fiscal sustainability, they should take care not to unnecessarily impede the current economic recovery. Fortunately, the two goals of achieving long-term fiscal sustainability and avoiding additional fiscal headwinds for the current recovery are fully compatible. Indeed, they are mutually reinforcing. On the one hand, a more robust recovery will lead to lower deficits and debt in coming years. On the other hand, a plan that clearly puts and credibly puts fiscal policy on a path to sustainability could help keep longer-term interest rates low and improve household and business confidence, thereby supporting improved economic performance today. Fiscal policymakers can also promote stronger economic performance in the medium term through the careful design of tax policies and spending programs. To the fullest extent possible, our nation's tax and spending policies should increase the incentives to work and save, encourage investments in the skills of our workforce, stimulate private capital formation, promote research and development, and provide necessary public infrastructure. Although we cannot expect our economy to grow its way out of our fiscal imbalances, a more productive economy will ease the trade-offs that we face and increase the likelihood that we leave a healthy economy to our children and grandchildren. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Put the clock. We agree completely with the last part of your statement, which is if we don't get our fiscal house in order, it's going to get ugly pretty fast. Also, I want to salute you for having more transparency on the operation of the Federal Reserve. The latest FOMC statement clearly was an attempt to put your policy on the table and let the country see it. But it's in that policy that I have a couple of questions. Early on, you put out an inflation target rate of 2%. That puts more certainty, more clarity. But at the end of the statement, I'm just going to quote it. In setting monetary policy, the committee seeks to mitigate deviations of inflation from its longer-term goal and deviations of employment from the committee's assessment of its maximum level. These objectives are generally complementary. However, under circumstances in which the committee judges that objectives are not complementary, it follows a balanced approach in promoting them, taking into account the magnitude of the deviations and the potentially different time horizons over which employment and inflation are projected to return to levels judged consistent with its mandates. Here's what I don't get. It seems as if you're moving away from an inflation target with that kind of a statement, and at best it's ambiguous. At worst, it says that if the deviation is higher on unemployment, which clearly it is, than it is on inflation, it follows, my interpretation is that the Fed is willing to accept higher levels of inflation than your preferred rate in order to chase your employment mandate. Is that not what we should interpret out of this?
No, Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't say that's correct. So 2% is our definition of price stability. As part of our mandate, we want to achieve that 2% inflation rate in the medium term. Obviously, monetary policy works with a lag. We can't achieve it every day, every week, but over a period of time, we want to move inflation always back towards 2%. We are not seeking, we will not actively seek to raise inflation or to move away from the target. We're always trying to bring inflation back to the target. The only sense in which there's a balance, of course, is that in looking at the two sides of the mandate, the rate of speed, the aggressiveness, may depend to some extent on the balance between the two objectives. But we're always trying to return both objectives back to their mandate. We are not seeking higher inflation. We do not want higher inflation, and we're not tolerating higher inflation.
The core mission of every central bank is stable prices. It's a necessary precondition for economic growth and therefore then full employment, at least in some of our judgment. And you and I have talked about mandates single versus double a lot. Mm-hmm. But if we're to say that we're now going to look at the deviations between the two, and if we're saying that we think that full employment is 5.2 to 6%, we're clearly way above that, but at your PCE, we're closer to where your inflation target is. I don't know how else to interpret this, that the result of this balanced approach is that higher than preferred inflation may be tolerated. Not that it's desired, but that it will be tolerated. And I'll simply just quote Paul Volcker, who said in the late 1970s, central bankers who are willing to tolerate a little more inflation usually end up getting a whole lot more than they expected. My concern is that this appears less to be an inflation targeting statement than an inflation equivocation statement, because we're now targeting deviations. And that's the concern. When this statement was released, we saw a buildup of commodity prices, even though I think you've said fairly recently that demand is down, therefore commodity prices should be low. So my basic question is, if this is our interpretation and we have a spike in commodity prices that occurred after the statement released, is that not the market's interpretation of this statement?
Mr. Chairman, first of all, as we say, the two sides of the mandate are generally complementary. I mean, we agree that low inflation, low stable inflation is good for the economy, and it's good for growth, it's good for employment, and we think most of the time that there's a complementary relationship between those two. The actual results you mentioned, you discussed earlier, the responsibility of the central bank for the dollar and for the price level. Inflation currently looks to be very well controlled. Our expectation, of course, we'll adjust policy as needed, but our expectation is that inflation will be below target over the next couple of years. Of course, unanticipated events can happen. The dollar's been pretty stable for since the crisis. I don't think you should read into this any unwillingness to keep price stability as a critical goal of the central bank. All central banks, including those with a price stability mandate, take into account to some extent the overall state of the economy, but over the medium term, they seek to return inflation to its objective, and that's what we're intending to do.
So let me turn to quantitative easing. The Federal Reserve has applied an unusual and unprecedented amount of monetary easing for a long period of time, not just during the crisis moments, but well after that, and now apparently through 2014. And by buying down Treasury rates, is it your view that this is putting an artificial cap on price discovery in the Treasury markets, and is that not lulling policymakers, fiscal policymakers, into a false sense of security when true price discovery in our Treasury markets, like it has in other countries, might give us the wake-up call we need to get our act in order to fix our problem? Are we not lulling ourselves in a false sense of security by this intervention in the Treasury markets?
Mr. Chairman, first, quantitative easing is very analogous to the usual monetary policy of cutting short-term interest rates. I mean, basically, that also lowers longer-term rates. It's basically a way of trying to provide more support for the economy. Our policies are hardly unusual. At this point, almost every major industrial central bank, excluding Canada, which had less of a recession than we did, has a large balance sheet and low interest rates, and including the ones with single mandates. And again, as I mentioned, we're not having any signs of higher inflation or a declining dollar. In terms of the issue relating to distorting the bond market, again, it's the objective of the policy to get rates somewhat lower to provide more support for the economy and to bring inflation up to target if necessary. But I think the basic reasons for low long-term rates, which are also a feature of every other major industrial economy, are low inflation, slow expected growth, and the fact that the dollar is a safe haven. And with problems in the world, people are investing in U.S. Treasuries because they're attractive. I think it's important for me to say that if Congress is being lulled, they shouldn't be lulled. I think we agree that attention needs to be paid to these issues. As the case of some of the countries you're referring to, like Greece and Portugal, suggests, if investors lose confidence in the fiscal policy of a country, the rates are going to go up, and there's nothing the central bank can do about that. And so you should obviously, it's important for Congress to address these problems, and I've spoken out about it quite consistently, as you know.
I think we would agree that we think